Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Allen. I'm the teen coordinator over at the Muskogee Public Library, which is a branch of the Eastern Oklahoma Library System. Today, I'm here with Danny Fingeroth, author of A Marvelous Life. And Danny, do you want to take it away?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up. I see some familiar names on the participants list there. Some comic book legendary editor Kevin Dooley is here, and equally legendary comic book historian Peter Sanderson is here. Dory Tano of the Comics Cube podcast. I'm sure I'm missing some people, but thanks everybody, and thank you people who actually live in Muskogee for showing up. Rachel, thank you, and the library and everyone else for inviting me. I wrote a biography of Stan Lee. Maybe you heard about it. It's not that other biography that you might have been hearing about. Mine is called A Marvelous Life: The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. And I know the event has been, I guess the title that you guys were nice enough to give it was sort of implied that I was like close buddies with Stan Lee. And I certainly knew him for decades, worked with him on many projects. But I would say that I was a colleague. I was friendly with him, but not, for better or worse, in his inner circle. And I think that in some ways makes me a very appropriate person to write a biography, because I knew Stan. I worked in the same business. I performed many of the same duties at Marvel Comics, where I ran the Spider-Man line, which was kind of a company within a company for many years. So I think I understood and understand Stan Lee's career and life in a way that even the most scrupulous, talented biographer or scholar who was not from within the comic industry really could. And as you can see, I'm talking to you from Dr. Strange's sanctorum in the Greenwich Village, or at least a facsimile thereof. Some of you may think of it as the Spirit's underground headquarters and Wildwood Cemetery. So we're here. I've been invited, and again, thank you, to talk about Stan and about the book. So I think I'm going to start out. I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book, and just if you like the way that sounds, I did my own audiobook. So 14 hours of me reading would be, I don't know how you could turn that down. And the
Sounds good.
So I'll do a reading. Then we have a slideshow PowerPoint presentation that I'll kind of narrate, and then I will talk with Rachel, and we'll take your questions, and we'll have fun, whether we like it or not. And I hope everybody is ready for a fun ride. I hope this is a nice diversion from our strange world, and I hope everybody's doing well. Anyway, all right, so I'm going to read. It is from A Marvelous Life, and this is the. This is not the PowerPoint. So, is it possible to keep the camera on me? Because I'm just going to be looking into the camera. Whatever. It's Zoom. It's 2021. It's from the preface. If you ask most culturally aware people to name their top 3 comic book creators, they'll likely respond, Stan Lee. And then they'll stop. That's the only comic book creator most people know. These same people could probably name 10 movie directors or novelists, maybe even 10 painters. But comic book creators, 1, Stan Lee, which is strange for any number of reasons. For starters, Lee was a comic book writer, editor, art director, publisher, and executive. However, despite the very visual nature of comics, Lee did not draw professionally. He was not a comic book. Also, while the characters he was involved with have become some of the most popular and lucrative entertainment franchises of all time, Spider-Man, the Avengers, the X-Men, to name just a few, Lee did not design the characters or draw their adventures. He needed artists to do that and collaborated with incredibly gifted ones to create Marvel's most famous superheroes. Lee's two most significant collaborators were Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. You would think that as the men who partnered with Lee to breathe life into the characters and their adventures, they would be as world famous as Lee, wouldn't you? But they aren't. Beyond that, logic would seem to dictate that since Lee was associated with Marvel for more than 75 years, he must have been one of the company's owners. That every time a ticket for a Marvel movie was sold, some fraction of it must have gone to him. That, however, is not true. Lee was always an employee of the company, a well-paid one to be sure, but one who owned no percentage of any of the characters he worked on there. And yet Lee became the voice and face, not just of Marvel Comics, but eventually, whether he intended to or not, of comics in general. This fame was based, originally, on the long stream of success that Marvel's comics had from 1961 to 1970, when its most famous characters were created, when Marvel was part of the cultural conversation, along with James Bond, Kurt Vonnegut, Betty Friedan, Mickey Mantle, Muhammad Ali, and the Beatles. That's 10 years in a life that lasted more than 95 and a career that went for almost 80. To most people, Stanley is that spry, wisecracking old man of 1,000 cameos in Marvel's movies and TV shows. They're not sure exactly what he does or did, but they know he somehow was involved with Marvel in its earliest days and that he's adorable, like a charming, mischievous, elderly relative you see at weddings and funerals. You're not really sure how he's related to you, but he's always fun to schmooze with for a couple of minutes, and you walk away with a smile on your face. To those who know something of comics history, Lee was the co-creator of the Marvel Universe and the main, for a long time, the only promoter of the comics and the people who made them, who at a certain point had his name above the title as the presenter of the comics, and who spent recent decades doing unspecified show business in Hollywood. To many of those who worked for and with him, Stan Lee was a great boss, providing them with regular assignments, concerned about them and their families, and who inspired them to do their best work. To others, he was a flawed but decent guy who they wished had perhaps been better than he was. And to a small group of comics fans and professionals, he was the most dastardly of villains, exploiting victimized artists who did all the real creative work, while he was just a lucky, slimy manipulator who was in the right place at the right time. Whatever you may think about Stan Lee, or even if you don't know much about him at all, I'm hoping this biography will give a bit of depth and dimension to the man and his achievements and show you that no matter what you thought, there was more to the story than you realized. What Stan Lee set into motion and how it grew beyond anyone's wildest expectations is a fascinating story, every bit as strange and unlikely as any of the adventures of superhuman mutants and Spider-Men that Marvel's comics told. If you want to understand America's popular culture, the stories we tell ourselves to explain ourselves, Stan Lee's life story is a pretty good place to start. That's the end of the reading.
That's excellent.
Thank you. English is my native language, so thank you. So let's, can we go into the, thank you, Kevin. Can we go into the PowerPoint? Whoa, hey. And many thanks to Jason Gonzalez behind the scene. All right, that's the cover, and print it in your brains, memorize it, never forget it. That's the cover of the paperback as well as the hardcover. The paperback came out in September and is still available, and the hardcover is too. There, the book has a bunch of photos, a couple which we'll see tonight, but a bunch of photos that I think are pretty rare. Not a lot of them are not the usual photos you've seen of Stan. Anyway, next, please. Oh, okay. This is the inside cover of a comic called Fantasy Masterpieces, #1. And this is for baby boomers, which I am one of those dreaded baby boomers. For a long time, this was our image of Stan Lee. There were no Marvel TV shows. They had just were beginning with some cartoons, but this was Stan, and this was the image he portrayed, dressed kind of in the Frank Sinatra hat, sitting on a stool, very friendly, folding a comic in those days when you could fold comics. He was the friendly, affable adult, the adult who understood in a way your parents didn't, and your teachers didn't, why you love these comics. This was like the early Marvel, quote unquote, Marvel age, say the early 60s, early to mid 60s. We didn't know that Stan was bald and vain about it. That's why he wore the hat. It looked cool, but he wasn't. Maybe 10 years later, he was sort of dressing in a way that might, be an attempt at being hip. But right here, he wasn't. Right here, he was being an adult, but an adult who understood why you loved these stories you love. Next, please. This is just a little closer. This is a, this, as I say, for a long time, Stan would do pretty frequent radio appearances, especially in the local New York area. So, we knew the voice, and we really knew, but this face perfectly matched the voice in the comic books. The voice that screamed at you on the covers that you had to open this comic and buy it. It was the most important cultural event of your entire life and probably the entire 20th century. This was the guy. This was the person who bonded Marvel with its public. Next, please. This is Stan and his family. That's his father, Jack, holding baby Larry. This must be Larry Stan was born in 1922, but in December, late December 22. So he's about 9 years old on the left there. That's Larry Lieber. Stan was born Stanley Martin Lieber in Manhattan. And here, that's his father, Jack, and his mother, Celia. And they're probably in Washington Heights, which oddly enough is where I am sitting right now in Upper Manhattan near the George Washington Bridge, if you know your New York geography at all. It's a little more gentrified since the days Stan lived here. Next, please. And this is, so Stan grew up bouncing back and forth between the Bronx and Manhattan. He loved all kinds of pop culture, but his family was desperately poor, and he needed and wanted to go out and make money. This is his high school graduation picture from the DeWitt Clinton High School yearbook. And Stan's ambition, as written in his yearbook, was to get to the top and stay there. So this is him. He graduated. He skipped a grade or two. This is him at about age 16 or so. Next, please. And Stan had a cousin. His mother's niece, I believe, was married to this guy, Martin Goodman. Goodman, despite his white hair, was only maybe in his 30s here. And Martin Goodman had this wild life, half of which I thought was made up, but apparently he really did ride the rails with hobos during the Depression. Goodman had started this publishing company and comic books, starting with Superman in 1938. Comic books in general and superhero comics in particular had become this incredible fad that took the nation by storm, and Goodman was publishing pulp magazines, which were kind of, they were popular fiction, all sorts of genres, science fiction and cowboy and romance and spies and every possible thing. And he wanted to get in on this comic book craze. So he started a line. It was called Timely Comics, which would later become Atlas, later become Marvel. And you can see he's holding a proof of an early issue of Captain America. Next, please. And there's Captain America. That was the very first issue. Goodman had had some success with titles, especially something called Marvel Tales, which is kind of where Marvel got its name. That featured the Submariner, the Human Torch, and that that did well in the wake of Superman and Batman over at DC Comics and some other superheroes. Captain America was a huge hit. It's dated March, but it came out most likely in December of 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor. And yet, so that means America, even though World War II had started, and Hitler had started and was in the midst of conquering Europe, America was not officially in the war yet. And here was Captain America taking a very bold stand against Hitler and advocating America entering the war. Goodman was Jewish. Stan was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Next, please. And these are Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, the creators of Captain America, and also the editor and editor-in-chief and art director of Marvel. So taking that stand was a major thing then. And they took a lot of flack for it. There were American Nazis would threaten their lives. It was kind of scary for them, but more to the point of the topic of the talk, Stanley Lieber had a number of jobs. He bounced in and out of various short-term employment. He wrote obituaries for people who were still alive. He worked in the garment district in Manhattan. And this distant relative, Martin Goodman, basically foisted him on Simon and Kirby as an assistant. Next, please. And that's where Stan did his first writing while he was their assistant. Comics in those days had to have some text material to qualify for a second class, for cheaper shipping rates as a periodical. So this was the first time Martin Lieber used the name Stan Lee in print and at all. And it's a ridiculous name. It's a name you pick when you're 17, when you think you're going to have a job for like 6 months and then go on to something else. Anytime I say to people, I've written a biography of Stan Lee, they go, Stan Lee who? And it takes like 3 rounds. And I think he went through that his whole life. It's a name you take when you're 17 and you need a quick pen name. He was saving his real name, so he claimed, for the great novels he would and screenplays he would write. But this was his very first stories. Captain America foils the Traitor's Revenge in Captain America issue 3, and illustrated by Jack Kirby. So it makes it the official first team up of Lee and Kirby. Next, please. Stan co-created lots of characters. Simon and Kirby had a falling out over promised royalties with Goodman. And somehow at age 18 or 19, Stan found himself the editor of this line of comics. Goodman kept saying he was going to hire a real adult, so to, quote unquote, but he never did. And so Stan co-created characters like the Destroyer. And so he did a lot of writing in all different genres, not just superheroes, and was also ran the line. And although the myth of Marvel is that, it's the little engine that could, it actually was an enormous company. They put out something near 80 titles a month. And Stan had teams of editors and teams of writers and teams of artists working under him in the timely offices. Next, please. Excuse me. He even, here he is in, that's Stan's original hairline, by the way, before he started losing it, and then before the later implants, which tried to replicate that. There's Stan in 1947. So he's about 24 years old. He never actually smoked a pipe. He just thought if you're an author with your picture in Writer's Digest, which was kind of the Bible of writing magazines, he should have a pipe. But he wrote this article, "There's Money in Comics." Weirdly enough, several years later, that article was referred to by Marshall McLuhan in kind of a derogatory way in an article that McLuhan wrote. But that didn't stop Stan from telling everybody that Marshall McLuhan's a fan of mine. Next, please. And this is Stan with the hair starting to go. This is the mid-50s. You could probably pinpoint it by seeing what, those are the current Marvel, I think they were known more as Atlas then. This is Stan. Again, the company was incredibly popular, but not especially distinguished. They put out a dozen different genres. Stan wrote a lot of comedy, a lot of romance. And they love to imitate what was popular for other publishing companies or on television, which was eating into comic book sales or in the movies. And Stan was sort of in this kind of velvet line trap where he was successful but longed to do other things. But he was heading up a very successful company run by a relative, and was doing well, well enough to achieve a nice suburban lifestyle. Next, please. So and then they had a big implosion. There was a distribution crisis we can talk about later if you want, but in any case, comics were in a big downturn because of the competition in television, because of negative publicity from people like a guy named Frederick Wortham, who was a psychiatrist, who claimed that comics were corrupting the youth of America and causing juvenile delinquency. And they ended up kind of reconfiguring and doing a very narrow line of comics. They were down to 8 a month, which they did as 16 bi-monthlies. And they did genre things like the science fiction. This is the first appearance of Groot, created by Stan and his brother Larry Lieber, who had come to work for the company, and of course by Jack Kirby. I think it's inked by Dick Ayers. But this was when Kirby had come back to Marvel. He kind of burned a lot of bridges at other companies and ended up back where he swore he'd never come. You're right, Kevin. The best comics do corrupt, and the best comics corrupt absolutely. Next, please. And so Stan, maybe I have the slides a lot of order, but so my apologies. But this was Stan at the height of his first wave and Marvel's first wave of popularity. This is the late 60s. Here's Stan with an actual beard, with a toupee that is really a terrific toupee. I believe he had 4 of them because he wanted it to look natural. So his hair he'd put on a different toupee every week and then get, say he'd gotten a haircut and start the cycle again. But this is really Stan at the peak of his first brush with celebrity, when he realized that he could build Marvel and Marvel could build him, and to become more than just some hack writer and editor sitting in an office in Manhattan churning out forgettable comics. Next, please. And these, sort of flip back a little in time to Stan before the toupees and yet not wearing hat. There he is with Jack Kirby, with whom he had some of his greatest successes and with whom he had a very complicated relationship. And of course, those are the big controversies of Stan's life and career: who got proper credit, who got proper money, who got proper fame. And on the right is Steve Ditko. With Ditko, Stan created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. With Kirby, pretty much everything else that we think of as Marvel from that early period till today: Thor and Iron Man and not Captain America, but the Avengers, X-Men, the Hulk, all that stuff. These 3, and Larry Lieber as well, who scripted a lot of the early stories, especially Groot and Thor and Ant-Man. Them and Goodman, really, all of what we know as Marvel comes from these people. Next, please. And this, of course, is the cover of the comic that started it all for modern Marvel in 1961, Fantastic Four #1, cover dated November. It really came out in August. They like to advance, put it on the covers to make it, so they would seem to be, not just current, but for the future. This was, if you look, this is the first we see of all the Fantastic Four characters, but Goodman wanted Stan to imitate the Justice League over at DC Comics, and because that was very popular, and that combined Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, the Flash, all their main characters. But Marvel hadn't put out superheroes for years, so the cover copy, and Stan loved cover copy and loved advertising type things, featuring the Thing, Mr. Fantastic, Human Torch, and Invisible Girl together for the first time in one mighty magazine. That sort of implies that they were popular on their own, and the Human Torch was a different version of a Marvel 40s character, 30s and 40s character. But this was, they had, none of them in those incarnations had been seen. So it was Lee and Kirby co-created it. Once again, endless controversy over who did what, and we can talk about that as we go on. Who did what in terms of inventing the characters, in terms of inventing the plots. These are the controversies of Stan Lee's life. The undeniable thing is that together, these characters were created, and nobody denies, well, I take that back, almost nobody denies, it was certainly Stan's dialogue, promo copy, and so on, sense of how to promote and advertise that really helped make Marvel special above and beyond the actual stories and characters. Next, please. And of course, eventually Marvel started up new characters, and they did all appear together in the Avengers. That's Loki, who is Tom Hiddleston from the movies, Iron Man in a very early incarnation of his armor, the Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. Next, please. And that, of course, eventually ended up in this unprecedented phenomenon of the Marvel movies and TV shows and games. Avengers Endgame being probably the most successful in terms of box office. Robert Downey Jr. born to play Iron Man. I mean, this phenomenon lasted so long and is now more popular than ever is really a pretty amazing thing. Next, please. The other, probably Marvel's most well-known, most famous, most popular, I guess most well-known and most famous are the same thing. But the most popular character, Spider-Man, created by Lee and Ditko, although this cover of Amazing Fantasy 15, where the character debuted, was drawn by Kirby and inked by Ditko. What is there to say? Spider-Man. I mean, this is just an incredible phenomenon. That once again, controversy between Lee and Ditko. A lot of what I got about who did what, who had credit, who deserved credit, what I go into a lot in the book is about the complicated relationships between Stan and these guys. There are some, people that would, it's easiest to talk about them either as, they were just, creative partners and they loved each other, or the other one, of course, is, that Ditko and Kirby hated Stan and he abused them. And, there's elements of truth, but it's a very complicated, I see my book, much of it is almost about, I don't know if you call it a love story, but about the complicated relationships between Stan and his collaborators and Stan and the various business people that owned Marvel, as well as about Stan and his family. Next, please. And, this is part, the Spider-Man, this is the Spider-Man phenomenon, the Marvel phenomenon, just these Spider-Verse characters that we know, and the Miles Morales Spider-Man, that's a whole phenomenon of its own as well. So these things that Stan and Kirby and Ditko and Larry Lieber put together on the run, on the fly, never imagining that anybody be thinking or talking about them 60 years later. It's just incredible, but there it is. Next, please. This was a surreal phenomenon for me. As I said, I did work with Stan, oddly enough, after I left Marvel, a lot, but also quite a bit at Marvel. This was the Amazing Spider-Man annual from 1984, which seems like it's quite a long time ago now, that Stan did the script for. The story was actually plotted by Tom DeFalco and drawn by Ron Frenz and Bob Layton, and Butch Geist also helped with the inking. But, it was very surreal for me to be, in effect, Stan's boss and editing his script and making suggestions and having him take them seriously. It was, it was strange, but he was very professional. And, if there was a point about his dialogue I disagreed with, he sometimes would, he would either say it was a good idea, he'll quote unquote fix it, or he would argue his point, but I was the editor, whatever I want. It was very just unreal, surreal, out of body, the whole thing. Anyway, next, please. And then this is Stan and me at a Wizard World convention. Wizard was a chain of comic book conventions that's still in business, but they're mostly online now because nobody's really doing comic conventions. But I was Stan's moderator for several years on the Wizard World tour. Mostly my job was to. His hearing was bad, so mostly my job was to transmit the questions from the audience to Stan and to tell him when it was time to go. I have one or two kind of funny stories from the moderating period we can talk about if you want. Next, please. And then this, I just figure for some of you, or for all of us, but maybe the people who don't know much about the early days of Marvel, this, of course, is the Stan from the cameos, which he loved to do. It's also part of the controversy because Stan got to be famous when Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko didn't. Of course, he liked acting. I think that was probably his first career choice. Was he would have liked to have been an actor. So that's him in one of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies as the music teacher who misses the whole battle going on behind him. There he is as the nearsighted barber in Thor, one of the Thor movies. Next, please. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm on social media. I'm at DannyFingeroth.com. So Twitter at Danny Fingeroth, Facebook. You can find me, and that's a very brief summary of Stan's life. And I'd love to, Rachel, if you have any questions, or if you want to take any of the audience questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Danny. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
I do want to ask about something that I really enjoyed in your book, where you mention a Princeton English major would anoint Marvel Comics as the 20th century mythology and Stanley as this generation's Homer. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's so true, and that's why the MCU especially is so popular.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you asked me that, because I literally, like an hour ago, got an approval from the WonderCon convention, which is run by the people who do the San Diego Con, but it's in the spring and it's going to be virtual this year. And I just got approval for a panel called Stanley Goes to College, which it's about Stan's earliest. For about 10 years, Stan lectured at colleges. And when I say lectured, I'll tell you about that in a second. But two of the people who'll be on the panel, I'm going to have Michael Uslan on the panel, who's the producer of the Batman movies. Maybe you know his name, and he was involved with Stan's campus appearances. And I'm having two brothers named, I hope, I have to actually confirm with them, who were the Princeton students who invited Stan to Princeton in 1966. He'd already done some speaking. I'd talk about that quite a bit in the book. He'd been to Bard College. And again, I mean, obviously he got a speaker's fee, which was nice, but he got to promote Marvel and he also got to build his own public personality. But as far, yes, Stan realized, especially when they started putting out the Fantastic Four, but even before that, he was getting letters from adults, right? They would get very few letters in the old days. DC Comics at that time, in the early 60s, had a pretty robust letter section. And it was mostly letters from kids, but there were adults like Roy Thomas, who later became, of course, a prominent writer and editor at Marvel and at DC, and puts out his alter ego magazine for Tomorrow's Publishing now. But people like him and Jerry Bales, there were people who had read comics in the 40s as children and kept up an interest in it, and they recognized the name Stan Lee, and so they would write him letters, and then there were college kids reading the comics. And oddly enough, in the days before underground comics, before Robert Crumb and people like that started making underground comics, counterculture rock bands would, perhaps under some kind of substance, I don't want to judge or comment, but perhaps under some kind of altered consciousness, were reading comics and reading into them and referencing the characters in the lyrics to songs. So Stan realized that he had a chance to build an audience that was not just children, although he never gave up the kid audience. He realized that was important, especially in that era. But he realized, okay, here's an audience and a way to make comics a little cooler, a little hipper, a little more literate. And I think he had these ambitions of wanting to do more, of wanting to write a novel, of wanting to write screenplays, but wasn't quite ready, or maybe didn't quite know how. But somewhere in him, I think he was sort of encouraged, instead of putting out these endless genre comics that nobody saw, suddenly he was getting feedback, starting with Roy Thomas's review in a obscure fanzine, a Fantastic Four 1. And so he just started having correspondence and playing to that crowd. He had this instinct. Maybe Julie Schwartz had it a little bit at DC. Julie, I think, maybe realized that there was an audience. Comics were really in big trouble, especially from television. I mean, that was, everybody had. I mean, I know it was only 3 channels and locals, but suddenly everybody had this incredible entertainment box in their house in a way that impacted people's consciousness that even radio didn't, although radio was a big part of Stan's background too, radio drama and news and so on. So being invited to speak at places like Princeton for a guy who, basically, kind of just gritted his teeth and made his way through high school in the Bronx was a big, flattering thing. And Stan was living in the suburbs amid all these successful doctors and lawyers and business people. I think this sort of was his, sort of be invited to speak at Bard or Princeton. Now, of course, when Stan was invited to speak, and this is a story I've heard, numerous times, he would say, well, I'm going to depart from my prepared notes, and he'd throw away the sheaf of paper and then basically just take questions. And then, somebody would later on would pick up the pages and they were just blank paper. He had not prepared a speech at all, but he was very good at thinking and speaking on his feet. So if you asked him a question, he could riff on it and be very funny and charming. And he did that for about 10 years. And, I think it was if you saw him at a comic convention anywhere in the past 50 years, you'd pretty much, I think that's what he did at colleges.
Yeah, that's, I think, probably one of the reasons he's so well known is just continually finding new ways to generate a fan base, like you were saying, the music, and then we have the MCU now. And I knew the name Stanley before I ever watched Iron Man, so he must have been doing something right.
Yeah. Well, he did. He made him, that that was led to sort of this strange, very long period of like 20 or 30 years, where because everybody knew that, now he moved to Hollywood in 1980, and he really wanted to grow beyond comics because he never really got over that shame that people of that generation felt over being in comics. And of course, the business had been through so many ups and downs and booms and busts. I think he felt he needed to do something else. And yet, even though, so if there's any tragic aspect to his life, it was that people, everybody would take a meeting with him, because who wouldn't take a meeting with Stan Lee? I mean, what fun. But to get anybody to actually buy a project, including the Marvel characters that he was trying to sell, was very difficult.
Well, I guess we can start with some of these questions, since we are getting a little low on time. I have a question from Kevin Dooley. Weren't there comics before Superman? Collections of comic strips and so on.
Yes, Kevin, there were. And you know the answer to that, you with your fancy Stanley hat in your picture there. Yes, there had been comic books started as collections of newspaper comic strips, which were very popular, obviously. Those, I mean, it's hard enough for young people to even really relate to how popular newspapers were, but newspapers comic strips were intended and did increase popularity. We had all sorts of circulation wars between Pulitzer and Hearst, and successful comic strip cartoonists lived and were treated like rock stars. They were celebrities. I mean, I guess maybe Charles Schultz might be a name people know, or Al Cap. I don't even know who, I guess the guy who did The Far Side now, but I mean, so Stan tried to break into that business too. Stan spent a lot of his career trying to get the hell out of comics. It's very odd, but anybody who's been in comics understands it, because it can be kind of ghettoizing, and, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So yes, there were collections of comic strips starting, well, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between 1849 and 1930. Those are depending, I mean, there's an easy to digest origin of comic books. It started with Max Gaines, who folded over a Sunday newspaper supplement and stuck a 10-cent sticker on it, and they began. But, like many creation stories, it's more convenient than it is true. But yes, Kevin, there were, comics were very popular, but I think Superman brought a popularity to comics that was leaps and bounds, if you pardon the expression, over what they had been before. And I think that, it's what I call the superhero the killer app of comic books. It was just the thing that made that mushroomed their popularity, and that made a lot of publishers like Martin Goodman want to get into that business.
I have a question from Stephen Commander. That's a pretty awesome name. He wants to know about Stanley's talk show that only had a pilot.
I do. I mean, I had in the late '60s, that beard and toupee period that I showed that photo of. As part, it seems to me, I could never find out, because when I did ask Stan about it, he had absolutely no memory of it at all. But there's like an hour or 90-minute. It's Stan talking. It's 1968. It's somewhere, I think, after. So that year, as you may recall, or may have read about, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the rise of the Chicago Convention, all that stuff was going on, and Stan kind of, there's this pilot of Stan speaking to student radicals and student journalists from the New York area, and Stan sort of trying to be the mature adult in the room and talk to them about the counterculture and drugs and politics. And he wasn't, it's available, it's online. I think you can find it on YouTube, but I had it transcribed, and I tracked down anybody I could who was alive and still had been involved with it at all. And yeah, it's fascinating because Stan actually was not bad as a talk show host. He was kind of the voice of maybe slightly, well, of centrist liberal thought, kind of the suburban dad. And Stan comes out very forcefully against the Vietnam War in this video. And I think I mean, I don't, my guess, and because I could never find, I mean, it's there to see and to hear, and I do talk about it. It seems like that he couldn't do two things at once. In other words, he could not be a talk show host with even a mild opinion without risking alienating half of Marvel's readers. Marvel was pretty evenly split, or at least the readers ran the whole gamut. So I think whether or not the show was picked up, it would have been an entire change in life mission for him. But it's very interesting. And so I quote parts of it, and yeah, there's quite a bit about it because Stan, it wasn't. I put it in the context. Stan lived and worked in Manhattan. He was right there in the media center of the world, and he was easy to get. If any radio show host or any radio or media person who wanted to talk to somebody about comic books and kids today, Stanley was there. He was available. He lived and worked in Midtown, so he could literally walk to any radio or TV station, and he did. And that's one of the fascinating things about his archives, where this material is there's all these radio and TV recordings, and some of them are just kind of anodyne, and they're like, Marvel's great, we love Spidey or whatever. But some of it, as I always found with Stan's interviews and convention appearances, is that Stan, I think, was compelled to tell the truth about a lot of things that you would think that somebody in his position wouldn't, but he didn't dramatize it. So he would give you like boilerplate answer, mind-blowing revelation, boilerplate answer, but the mind-blowing revelation would be in the same tone as "Isn't Spidey great?" So you have to listen to it. But he loved being on the radio and TV, especially radio in the '60s, and he was on it all the time. So I think this other thing was a natural extension, and if and Stan loved to entertain. If anybody who socialized with him in those days always would refer to his either the parties that he and his wife threw or that they attended as the Stan and Joan show. That they just were the center of attention. They were good looking. That's why he got the toupee. He wanted to think. I think he was vain. Who isn't? And so yeah. So that I do go quite a bit into that that TV pilot.
He definitely had some noticeable charisma and energy going on all the time.
Yeah.
It seemed like. Okay, question from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Dietano. Has anyone done more than Stan in terms of getting as many people to even start reading comic books, / be aware of comic books, / continue reading comic books once they've started reading it? Good question.
The only comparable figure, and Kevin, maybe you or Peter Sanderson, maybe you guys have some thoughts on this. The only comparable figure I would that comes to my mind is Robert Crumb, and obviously not for superhero comics, but kind of Crumb. I mean, we just lost S. Clay Wilson a couple of days ago, who was one of the major and most transgressive underground cartoonists of the '60s, and I bet most of the audience, maybe it's a self-selective audience of comics fans, but most people have never heard of S. Clay Wilson, So maybe Crumb, who kind of I don't know if intentionally, but he, became the face and voice. Maybe Art Spiegelman with Mouse in more recent years. Maybe Crumb or Spiegelman. I don't know if there's anybody from so-called mainstream comics who did what Stan did.
I have a question from Jason Gonzalez, actually, who's helping us out today. Is there a superhero comic hero that hasn't become mainstream or popular that you would like to see make it big? And he says, I became a fan of comics during the 80s via Spider-Man. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. Well, I don't know if you meant to set me up for this or not. However, I wrote a comic series from Marvel in the 90s called Darkhawk. That was kind of Spider-Man for the 90s. And the character's 30th anniversary is coming up. And actually, Mike Manley, he and I were the writer-artist on Darkhawk, which was co-created by Mike and Tom DeFalco, actually. But I wrote every issue of the comic. They're doing a 30th anniversary Darkhawk comic, and Mike and I have a new story coming out. Should be out in April. So whether you intended to give me a chance for a plug or not, certainly in Stan's tradition, I want to be sure to make sure that everybody looks out for the Darkhawk one-shot Heart of the Hawk coming up in April.
Sounds great. I think you advertised that pretty well too, in the vein of Stanley with that same energy.
Well, I try.
A question from me, actually. I would like to know, can you describe what it felt like to go from enjoying Marvel Comics as a fan to working there as an editor?
Okay, well, that's a long question. And again, I think there are some people, I think Kevin and Peter, it's this incredible, it was great, and it was intense, and it had that ecstasy and that disappointment that can only come from working in this thing you loved as a child, because nothing can thrill you like the thing you loved as a child, and nothing can break your heart like something you loved as a child. So, so it was, our joke used to be, it beats having a real job. Well, that was a flip thing to say. It was very much like having a real job with real bosses and real deadlines, and real office politics. But at the end of the day, you kind of step back and you go, okay, so I spent the day talking about Spider-Man. That's pretty good, because I've had jobs that haven't been in comics, and I can't say that they were particularly more pleasant, and they didn't have the positive side of getting to spend your day talking about Spider-Man, of which the best part might have been, I'm being a little facetious, but, to go out to a plot lunch, at a local restaurant near the office and be talking about, like blowing up the world, or, how many people are going to die, or who's going to, be in, talking about all this cataclysmic end of world kind of stuff, and have people, look at you. Well, I will tell a story that's tangentially connected, only because, and I'll plug something else too. Al Jaffe, the famous Mad Magazine writer and cartoonist who did Snappy Answers, Stupid Questions, and the Mad Fold. And I'm happy to go past the hour, by the way. So, since if anybody's willing to stick around, so I'm going to tell a story that Al Jaffe, who actually worked for Stan in the 40s and 50s as an editor and writer and a cartoonist at Marvel. Al Jaffe would have dinner on a regular basis with Irwin Hazen. Irwin was the co-creator of Dondi, but also did Gold and Silver Age stuff. I'll try to make this story short because it is so off topic. Irwin and Al were pals. Al had just broken up with his first wife, and and Irwin died at 96. Al's about to turn 100, and I'm going to do a panel on the Comixplex website in tribute to Al's birthday. It should be on March 13th, which will be Al's 100th. Anyway, they're in a restaurant, and they're talking and gossiping, and they see that this couple next door at the next table seems to be eavesdropping, and they find it really annoying. So suddenly Al says, Irwin, I don't know what happened to me. She just got on my nerves one last time, and the next thing I knew, the knife was in my hand, and I'm stabbing and stabbing and stabbing, and blood is all over the place.
Oh,
and
no.
I just couldn't stop, and she's screaming, and I'm stabbing, and then I wrapped her up in a carpet, and then I dragged it out to and I don't know what and what Irwin and Al both described as the old couple next to them was, shocked and taken aback and left the restaurant. And of course, there's a story. Let me just make clear that Al just completely made up. It was completely fictitious. And so that's kind of that's the milieu that Stan, those are like Stan's, not Irwin, but Al was pals and always, and still does admire Stan. The punch, and then just again, to go even further off topic, one night Irwin was telling that story at an event I was attending. And so here's these guys both well into their 90s remembering this story. And I said, I think Irwin was telling it, but Al was there too. I said, so Irwin, when you say the couple in the table next to you were old, at 96, what do you mean that they were old? So, they were in their 50s, right? Which I thought was very funny. Anyway, I apologize. I don't even know how I got to that story, so I'll take more questions.
I enjoyed hearing it. Okay, we do need to wrap up here soon, though, so let me get a couple more things in. Fallon Pryor would like to know if Stanley had a favorite Marvel character.
He probably did, and if I had a guess, well, actually, he always said it was the one he was working on at the moment.
That's a smart answer.
It's and he would say it's like asking who was your favorite child. I would say the only character that Stan ever decreed that no one else but him could write for about 20 years was the Silver Surfer. So I would imagine it was the Surfer, but I think he had a great fondness for Spider-Man. But I think just because that was the only character that Stan ever said, hands off, nobody but me gets to write him. I'd say the Surfer.
Okay. And Kevin Dooley is asking, would you consider your book here an authorized biography as far as it has interviews with Stan, correct?
Yes, it is totally not authorized. I had the best of both worlds. Because I actually for a while was negotiating with Stan and about it being authorized, and ultimately he said, if I wanted anybody to do it, Danny, it'll be you, but I don't want anybody to do it. Now, for all I know, I was the 10th person that week he'd said that to. So between that and shopping it around, my agent shopping it around, I signed the deal in 2016. And I called up Stan to tell him, and he said, well, good luck with it. I won't tell anybody to talk to you, to not talk to you, but I'm not going to be interviewed. I'm sick of being interviewed. But I ended up doing 2 lengthy interviews with him anyway. So no, it was totally not authorized. No one at Marvel, no one at Stan's, at POW, no one in Stan's family. Nobody had any had any vetting or veto power, and didn't see a word of it before it went out. So I interviewed Stan. I interviewed about 50 other people, Neil Adams and John Semper and Denny O'Neil, just a zillion people, and Stan, and a lengthy interview with Larry Lieber, his brother. So no, it's unauthorized, and yet I had access. So it really, like I said, it was kind of the best of the best of both.
And you had access to his archives too, right?
Well, anybody willing to fly to Laramie, Wyoming can have access to his archives. The trick, however, um, there is a plane. The plane that you take to fly to Stan's archive is nicknamed with good reason the Vomit Comet. And um, so I mean, if you have any credentials at all as a scholar or historian or just interested fan, um, his archives are in Wyoming. When you asked him why are your archives in Wyoming, which is a terrific. I mean, the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming is terrific, and the people there are great. But obviously, it's a long way to, Stan would say, well, Jack Benny, the radio and TV comedian, Jack Benny's archives are here, and if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. And I think that's part of it. I think part of it also was when he started donating his archives or selling them. I don't really know if he, what kind of deal he had. I don't think anybody in either coast, Karen Green of Columbia was not yet collecting pop culture archives and comics archives, nobody on the West Coast. So I think, although it's hard to imagine, I don't think there was a whole lot of interest outside that. But it also means, and one reason I went there was because I tried to just order stuff from the finding aid, and it was, a lot of it was, ambiguously labeled. So I realized I had to go. So one nice thing about it being so far away is that there've been not that many people. You really have to want to go. And it's fascinating. The archives are fascinating because they don't seem to be redacted. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the archives that doesn't necessarily make Stan look good. And there's hundreds. There's literally, at this point, there's like 200 boxes of his archives there. And the main reason I did go actually was to hear and see things like that video of him with the TV show pilot, because I just found incredible stuff there. That there were boxes. I'm exaggerating a little, but there was a whole category of material that was labeled pretty much radio and television interviews 1946 to 1980. And very little detail. And I went, I bet there's some gold. And there was just amazing stuff that I put not only in this book, but in a book that I co-edited with Roy Thomas about 10 years ago called The Stanley Universe, from Tomorrow's Publishing. And that book is still available also. And a lot of the full transcripts of a lot of those interviews and other interviews with Stan are in that book. If you're interested in another kind of deep dive into Stan, that Stanley Universe is worth checking out. And you can get it. It's available digitally too at a ridiculously low price from Tomorrow's Publishing.
Awesome. That sounds like another book we'll need to add to our collection then.
I think so.
Okay, so is there anything else that you want to mention while you're here or say before taking an exit?
No, I just thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for the great questions. I hope you learned a little bit about Stan. As I said, the book it's in multiple languages. It's in English, it's in hardcover, it's in softcover, it's in large type. It's audio, so if you enjoyed this past hour, imagine 14 hours of this. You can't mess it up.
And it's at your library.
And it's at your library, exactly. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been just an awesome session.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. All right, everybody, stay well. Take care. So how do I get out of here? I'll hit the leave button.
Yeah, press the leave button.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.
You can check out a whole bunch of different comics on our app Hoopla, which you can access for free with your library card. And make sure to check out A Marvelous Life at your local library. Thank you so much for joining us.